What if I told you that one president was worth $10 billion, dollars, while another left office so broke that Congress had to invent the presidential pension just to keep him from starving? That George Washington owned 300 enslaved people, while Harry Truman couldn't afford postage stamps? That a peanut farmer and a reality TV host both ended up in the Oval Office, and one of them made way more money than the other? Presidential wealth is absurd. It's uncomfortable. It's deeply ironic. And tonight we're going to talk about all of it. If you enjoy weird history delivered slowly enough to help you fall asleep, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Maybe give the video a like if you're still awake by the time we get to President number 12. It helps the algorithm think we're doing something right. Now get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Because for the next couple of hours, we're going to explore exactly how much money it took to run this country, from the richest president who ever lived to the ones who died owing everyone money. Starting with a man who literally put his name on buildings in gold letters, Donald Trump. Donald Trump walked into the White House in 2017 with an estimated net worth between $7 and $10 billion. That's billion. With a B, the kind of number that makes your brain hurt if you think about it too long, which is why we're not going to. Here's what matters. Trump made his fortune in real estate, specifically by slapping his name on buildings in Manhattan and then licensing that name to buildings everywhere else. Hotels, golf courses, steaks, vodka, a university that was definitely not a university. The man turned his last name into a brand, and that brand was worth billions before he ever considered politics. Now, estimating Trump's actual wealth is about as precise as throwing darts blindfolded, because his assets are tied up in property valuations, licensing deals, and whatever the Trump organization claims on any given Tuesday. Financial disclosure forms showed hundreds of millions in income, but the exact number depends on who you ask and whether they're being sued at the time. What we know for certain is this. Trump was the first president to own a private jet with his name painted on the side in gold letters, the first to have his own line of steaks, the first to host a reality show where he fired people on camera for entertainment. He didn't take the presidential salary of $400,000 a year, instead donating it to various federal agencies, which honestly makes sense when your net worth has 9 zeros. Love him or hate him, Trump redefined what it meant to be a wealthy president. George Washington had land. Kennedy had family money. Trump had skyscrapers and a helicopter. And that brings us to the second richest president who inherited his billions the old-fashioned way from his incredibly wealthy father, John F. Kennedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was worth somewhere between $1.3 and $1.5 billion when he took office in 1961. But here's the thing. He didn't earn it. He inherited it. And there's a difference, historically speaking, between building an empire and being born into one with a trust fund the size of a small nation's GDP. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, made his fortune through banking, bootlegging during Prohibition, Hollywood film production, and stock market investments that would probably get you arrested today. By the time Jack was born in 1917, the Kennedy family was already obscenely wealthy. We're talking multiple estates, private islands, and the kind of old money that comes with monogrammed everything. JFK himself never really worked a normal job. He was a congressman, then a senator, then president. His wealth sat quietly in trusts and investments, generating passive income while he focused on looking good in a suit and giving speeches that made everyone feel hopeful about space travel. He donated his entire congressional and presidential salary to charity because when you're worth over $1 billion, $400,000 a year is basically a rounding error. The Kennedy fortune was vast enough to fund Jack's presidential campaign, his brother Bobby's political career, and Ted's decades in the Senate. It bought influence, access, and a compound in Hyannisport where the family still gathers to play touch football and presumably discuss stock portfolios. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Much of that wealth came from Joseph Kennedy's ruthless business dealings during the Great Depression, when fortunes could be made by people willing to do legally questionable things. The Kennedys spent generations polishing that legacy into something that looked like Camelot. And honestly, it worked. Which brings us to our first president, who also happened to be extremely rich, though his money came from something even less comfortable to discuss: enslaved labor. George Washington died in 1799, worth approximately 750 million to 900 million in today's dollars. That makes him the third richest president in American history, and easily the wealthiest of the founding fathers. But let's be very clear about where that money came from: land and slavery, mostly slavery. Washington inherited his first 10 enslaved people when he was 11 years old. By the time he died, Mount Vernon held over 300 enslaved individuals. His wealth wasn't just tied to slavery, it was built on it. The plantation system generated massive wealth for people like Washington, who owned thousands of acres across Virginia and what would become West Virginia. Tobacco, wheat, and eventually whiskey from his distillery created an agricultural empire that required enslaved labor to function. Now, Washington did eventually come around to the idea that slavery was morally wrong. He wrote about it privately and freed all his enslaved workers in his will, the only slave-holding founder to do so. But that doesn't change the fact that he spent his entire life benefiting from a system that treated human beings. His wealth existed because of it. Beyond slavery, Washington was a shrewd land investor. He bought property all over the frontier, speculating that westward expansion would make him even richer. He was right. He also married Martha Custis, who brought her own considerable fortune to the marriage, because apparently even in 1759, rich people married rich people. Washington took no salary as commander of the Continental Army, only expense reimbursements, which somehow totaled more than any salary would have. As president, he accepted his $25,000 annual salary, though adjusted for inflation, that's about $700,000 today. And he spent it on fancy parties and maintaining the image of American dignity. But the real money stayed in Virginia, in land and labor. And speaking of founding fathers who died rich but lived complicated, let's talk about the man who designed Monticello, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is a financial paradox wrapped in an architectural blueprint. At his peak, he was worth somewhere between 300 and 350 million in today's dollars. By the time he died in 1826, he owed roughly 8 million in today's money. So we're dealing with a man who lived like royalty and died drowning in debt, which honestly tracks for someone who designed a house with secret passageways and a bed built into the wall. Jefferson inherited land and enslaved people from his father, then married Martha Wales Skelton, whose father's estate doubled his holdings when the man died. At one point, Jefferson owned around 600 enslaved people across multiple plantations. Monticello, his beloved estate, was built and maintained entirely by enslaved labor, including the Hemmings family, whose complicated relationship with Jefferson remains one of American history's most uncomfortable. But Jefferson spent money like it was going out of style. Books, wine, fancy furniture shipped from France, constant renovations to Monticello that never quite finished. He lived in Paris as ambassador and developed extremely expensive taste. He bought so many books that when he sold his personal library to Congress after the War of 1812, it formed the foundation of the Library of Congress. And then he immediately started buying more books. The man had a problem. Tobacco prices crashed, debts accumulated. By his final years, Jefferson was basically insolvent, and after his death, his family had to sell Monticello and most of his enslaved workers to pay creditors. It's a stark reminder that having money and managing money are two very different skills. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, founded the University of Virginia, and doubled the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. but he couldn't balance a budget to save his life. And that irony brings us to another Roosevelt, though not the one you're thinking of first. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, the trust-busting, moose-riding, teddy-bear-inspiring 26th president, was worth between $200 and $250 million when he took office in 1901. And unlike some presidents on this list, Roosevelt didn't have to build his fortune or even really think about it. He was born into it, with the kind of old New York money that came with multiple generations of quietly successful merchants and bankers. Roosevelt's family made their wealth in glass importing, real estate, and banking. By the time Teddy was born in 1858, the Roosevelts were firmly established in Manhattan high society. He grew up with private tutors, trips to Europe, and the assumption that he'd never have to work for money. Which is good, because Roosevelt had other plans, like boxing and hunting, and becoming president at age 42 after William McKinley was assassinated. But here's the thing about Roosevelt. Despite his enormous wealth, he didn't live like a robber baron. He lived like someone who read too many adventure novels as a kid and decided to make his entire life into one. He bought a cattle ranch in North Dakota and lost money on it. He went on safari in Africa and shot roughly everything that moved. He gave speeches while bleeding from an assassination attempt because finishing the speech seemed more important than, medical attention. Roosevelt's wealth gave him the freedom to pursue conservation, trust busting, and building the Panama Canal. He didn't need political favors or corporate money because he already had generational wealth sitting in trust funds. He could afford to be idealistic, which is a luxury most presidents didn't have. His distant cousin Franklin would later become president too, also wealthy, though not quite as rich. But we'll get to Franklin in a moment. First, let's talk about Lyndon Johnson, who made his money the old-fashioned way: Texas radio stations and a very convenient wife. Lyndon B. Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was worth between $150 and $200 million when he died in 1973. That's impressive for a guy who started out as a school teacher in rural Texas, but LBJ didn't get rich from teaching. He got rich from radio, television, and a marriage that turned out to be extremely financially advantageous. In 1943, Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, used money from her inheritance to buy a struggling radio station in Austin called KTBC. At the time, Lyndon was already a congressman, which meant he had connections at the Federal Communications Commission. And wouldn't you know it, KTBC suddenly got very favorable treatment. License renewals came through fast. Competitors faced obstacles. The station got exclusive broadcasting rights in Austin, and later the license to operate the only VHF television station in the city. Now, was this technically legal? Yes. Was it ethically questionable? Absolutely. But this was the 1940s, and the rules around conflicts of interest were about as solid as a campaign promise. The Johnson family broadcasting empire grew, and by the time LBJ became president in 1963, the family fortune was substantial. LBJ lived on a ranch in Texas Hill Country, sprawling and well-stocked with cattle. He loved driving around the property in his Lincoln Continental, sometimes with terrified guests, because Johnson had a habit of pretending the brakes failed as he drove toward the lake. The car was actually an amphicar that could float, but his passengers didn't know that until they hit the water. Hilarious if you're into presidential pranks that cause minor heart attacks. Johnson used his wealth to fund his political career, but he also used his political career to protect his wealth, which is a very circular and very American story. And speaking of circular American stories, let's talk about Herbert Hoover, who made millions as a mining engineer and then presided over the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover was worth between $120 and $150 million when he became president in 1929. He earned every penny of it himself, which makes him one of the only self-made millionaires on this list. But here's the tragic irony. Hoover made his fortune as a brilliant mining engineer and international businessman, then completely failed to manage the economy during the worst financial crisis in American history. It's like being an expert swimmer who somehow drowns in a bathtub. Hoover graduated from Stanford's very first class in 1895 with a geology degree. He worked as a mining engineer in Australia, China, and all over the world, earning a reputation for turning failing mines into profitable operations. By his 40s, Hoover was a millionaire many times over, consulting for mining companies and investing in ventures across the globe. He and his wife Lou spoke fluent Mandarin and once translated a 16th century mining text from Latin for fun, because apparently that's what rich mining engineers did for entertainment in 1912. When World War I broke out, Hoover organized relief efforts in Belgium, feeding millions of people and earning international praise. He served as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge, where he was wildly competent. Everyone assumed he'd be a great president. Then the stock market crashed in October 1929, 8 months into his term, and everything went sideways. Hoover's approach to the Depression was hands-off, rooted in the belief that the economy would self-correct and that government intervention would make things worse. He was wrong, spectacularly wrong. Shantytowns of homeless people became known as Hoovervilles. The country spiraled. And in 1932, voters elected Franklin Roosevelt in a landslide, because sometimes being rich and smart isn't enough if you don't understand when to break your own rules. Speaking of Franklin Roosevelt, let's talk about the other wealthy Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was worth approximately $90 to $100 million in today's currency, inherited largely from his family's old Hudson River Valley money. The Roosevelts of Hyde Park were wealthy landowners with investments in coal, railroads, and shipping. Franklin never had to worry about money, which freed him up to worry about everything else, like polio, the Great Depression, and whether the country should maybe join World War II. Roosevelt grew up at Springwood, the family estate in Hyde Park, New York. He attended Groton and Harvard, married his distant cousin Eleanor, and entered politics because that's what wealthy young men with good last names did in the early 1900s. He served as a New York State Senator, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and Governor of New York before winning the presidency in 1932. His wealth insulated him from political pressure. He didn't owe favors to corporate donors because he didn't need their money. This gave him the freedom to push through the New Deal, programs that fundamentally reshaped American government and society. Social Security, labor protections, banking reforms, all of it came from a wealthy man who decided that maybe capitalism needed some guardrails before it collapsed entirely. Roosevelt served 4 terms, the only president to do so, because the country kept re-electing him during the Depression and World War II. He died in office in 1945, still wealthy, still politically dominant, and still remembered as one of the most consequential presidents in American history. His wealth never defined him, but it certainly enabled him. And that brings us to someone whose wealth came much, much later. Bill Clinton, who left the White House relatively broke, and then made a fortune on the speaking circuit. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton is worth between $90 and $130 million today. But here's the catch. He didn't make that money until after he left office. Clinton grew up poor in Arkansas, the son of a traveling salesman who died before Bill was born. He worked his way through Georgetown, Yale Law, and Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, married Hillary Rodham, and became governor of Arkansas at 32. By the time he entered the White House in 1993, his net worth was basically a house in Little Rock and some modest savings. Presidential salaries don't make you rich. Clinton earned $200,000 a year for most of his presidency, which sounds like a lot until you remember you're also paying for your own food and incidentals at the White House. Legal fees from impeachment proceedings and investigations cost the Clintons millions. When they left Washington in 2001, Hillary famously said they were dead broke. This was an exaggeration. They weren't exactly destitute, but they also weren't wealthy by any meaningful standard. Then came the speaking circuit. Clinton gave speeches, lots of speeches, to corporations, foreign governments, trade associations, anyone willing to pay $200,000 to $750,000 per appearance. He wrote books. He started the Clinton Foundation. Hillary joined the Senate, then became Secretary of State, then ran for president twice. The money poured in. By the 2020s, the Clintons were worth well over $100 million, all earned after public service ended. It's a very modern kind of presidential wealth, built on fame, connections, and the fact that former presidents can charge obscene amounts of money to show up and talk for an hour. Clinton proved you don't have to be rich to become president, but it sure helps to become rich afterward. And speaking of presidents from modest backgrounds, let's talk about George H.W. Bush, who had a wealthy family but also made his own fortune in Texas oil. George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, was worth between $80 and $100 million, and his wealth came from a mix of family money and personal business success. Bush was born into privilege in Massachusetts, the son of Prescott Bush, a banker and U.S. Senator. But unlike some presidents who coasted on family wealth, George H.W. actually went out and made his own money, which for a guy born into Connecticut aristocracy is almost rebellious. After serving as a Navy pilot in World War II, Bush moved to Texas in 1948 to work in the oil industry. He co-founded Zapata Petroleum, an oil drilling company, and made millions during the Texas oil boom of the 1950s. By the time he entered politics, Bush was independently wealthy, though his family connections certainly didn't hurt his career trajectory. Bush served as a congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee, envoy to China, director of the CIA, vice president for 8 years under Reagan, and finally president from 1989 to 1993. It's one of the most impressive resumes in American political history, all funded by oil money and New England investment portfolios. Bush lived modestly for a multimillionaire. He had a summer home in Kennebunkport, Maine, where the family gathered for decades. He loved speedboats and driving way too fast on the water, which seems to be a theme with wealthy presidents. Despite his preppy background, Bush connected with regular voters by projecting a kind of awkward, earnest decency. He lost re-election in 1992, but left office with his wealth intact. His son, George W., would later become president too, also wealthy, which makes the Bushes one of only 2 families to produce multiple presidents. The other family, of course, was named Adams. But before we get nostalgic about founding fathers, let's talk about James Madison. James Madison was worth roughly $130 to $140 million at his peak, making him one of the wealthiest founding fathers. But like Jefferson, Madison's fortune was built on land and enslaved labor, specifically at Montpelier, his Virginia plantation. He inherited property and more than 100 enslaved people, then spent decades managing the estate while also writing large chunks of the Constitution and serving as the 4th president. Madison was brilliant. 5'4", 100 pounds soaking wet, and responsible for the framework of American government. He wrote the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, arguing for ratification of the Constitution. He served as Jefferson's Secretary of State, then won the presidency in 1808. He guided the country through the War of 1812, during which the British burned down the White House and Madison had to flee Washington. His wife Dolly famously saved a portrait of George Washington before evacuating, which is the most Dolly Madison thing possible. But Madison's wealth, like most founding fathers, depended on slavery. Montpelier required enslaved labor to function. When tobacco prices fell and the Virginia soil wore out, Madison struggled financially. He freed no one in his will. Dolly eventually had to sell Montpelier and many enslaved people to pay debts after Madison's death in 1836. Madison helped create a country based on liberty and self governance, but he never reconciled that vision with the reality of his own wealth, depending on human bondage. It's a contradiction that haunts his legacy, and frankly, the legacy of nearly every wealthy president before the Civil War. And speaking of contradictions, let's talk about Andrew Jackson, who hated banks and elites despite being a wealthy plantation owner himself. Andrew Jackson was worth between $130 and $150 million at his peak, and he earned it through land speculation, cotton farming, and enslaved labor. Jackson was born poor in the Carolina backcountry, orphaned at 14, and clawed his way to wealth through sheer aggression and a willingness to fight anyone over anything. Duels, bar fights, military battles. Jackson solved most problems with violence, and somehow it kept working. Jackson bought land in Tennessee when it was still frontier territory, built a plantation called the Hermitage, and grew cotton using enslaved labor. By the time he became president in 1829, he owned around 150 enslaved people. His wealth grew alongside his political and military career. He became a war hero after defeating the British at New Orleans in 1815, which launched him into national politics. As president, Jackson dismantled the Second Bank of the United States, claiming it favored the wealthy elite. This is ironic because Jackson himself was wealthy elite, but he positioned himself as a man of the people, a frontier populist who fought for the common man. His supporters loved it. His opponents called him a tyrant. Both were kind of right. Jackson also signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which forced tens of thousands of Native Americans off their land in what became the Trail of Tears. Thousands died. The land was then sold cheap to white settlers, enriching speculators and plantation owners. Jackson's legacy is complicated, to put it mildly. A champion of democracy for white men and an architect of genocide for Native peoples. Jackson died in 1845 at the Hermitage, still wealthy, still controversial. And now let's jump forward to a modern president who became rich through books and speeches. Barack Obama. Barack Obama is worth approximately $70 to $80 million as of 2025, and every penny of it came after he entered national politics. Obama grew up middle class in Hawaii, raised by his mother and grandparents. He went to Columbia and Harvard Law, worked as a community organizer in Chicago, taught constitutional law, and served in the Illinois State Senate. When he ran for U.S. Senate in 2004, his financial disclosure showed he and Michelle still had student loan debt. Then he gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention that summer, and everything changed. Obama became a political star overnight. He won his Senate seat easily, wrote a best-selling memoir called Dreams from My Father, and suddenly publishers were offering huge advances. In 2006, he signed a multi-book deal worth millions. The Audacity of Hope became another bestseller. By the time he ran for president in 2008, Obama was financially comfortable, though not yet wealthy. The real money came after his presidency. Obama and Michelle signed a joint book deal with Penguin Random House in 2017, reportedly worth $65 million. He produced documentaries for Netflix. He gave speeches for hundreds of thousands of dollars each. The Obamas bought a house in Washington, D.C., and an estate in Martha's Vineyard. They became the kind of wealthy that used to require inheriting a plantation, except they did it with book advances and streaming deals. Obama represents a new model of presidential wealth. Start modest, serve in office, then monetize your fame afterward. It's very 21st century, and it's made several recent presidents much richer than their salaries ever could. And speaking of monetizing fame, let's talk about Ronald Reagan, who was already rich before politics from his Hollywood career. Ronald Reagan was worth approximately $60 to $70 million when he died in 2004. And most of that wealth came from his decades as a Hollywood actor and his lucrative post gubernatorial speaking career. Reagan grew up poor in Illinois, the son of an alcoholic shoe salesman. He worked as a radio announcer, moved to California, and signed with Warner Brothers in 1937. For the next 2 decades, Reagan appeared in over 50 films, making decent money but never quite becoming a top tier star. Reagan served as president of the Screen Actors Guild, which introduced him to politics and union negotiations. He married actress Nancy Davis in 1952, and Nancy brought her own Hollywood connections and eventual influence. Reagan hosted General Electric Theater on television from 1954 to 1962, earning a substantial salary and giving speeches for GE across the country. This touring gig basically functioned as a paid political training program. By the time Reagan entered politics, he was financially secure. He served as California governor from 1967 to 1975, then lost the Republican primary in 1976, but won the presidency in 1980. His speaking fees and investments had already made him a millionaire several times over. Reagan loved his ranch in California and spent as much time there as possible during his presidency, clearing brush and riding horses like he was still starring in westerns. After leaving office in 1989, Reagan continued earning money through speeches and his autobiography. His wealth grew, though Alzheimer's diagnosis in 1994 ended his public life. Reagan proved that fame and wealth could come from Hollywood, then translate into political power, which honestly feels quaint now compared to reality TV stars becoming president. And speaking of modern presidents who weren't born rich, let's wrap up this section with Joe Biden. Joe Biden is worth approximately $45 to $55 million as of 2025, and just like Obama and Clinton, he made most of that money after leaving high office. Biden grew up middle class in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware. He became a lawyer, won a Senate seat at 29 in 1972, and spent the next 36 years as one of the least wealthy members of Congress. Seriously. Biden was regularly listed as one of the poorest senators, mostly because he commuted by Amtrak from Delaware every day rather than maintaining a second home in Washington. Biden's financial disclosures during his Senate years showed a net worth that fluctuated between modest and barely there. He lived on his Senate salary, which was decent but not wealth building. When he became vice president in 2009, his salary jumped to $230,000 a year, but he still had kids in college and regular expenses. The Biden family was comfortable but not rich by any definition that matters in presidential wealth rankings. Then 2017 happened. Biden left the vice presidency, and like Obama and Clinton before him, he hit the speaking circuit hard. He gave speeches for up to $200,000 each. He wrote a memoir, Promise Me, Dad, which became a bestseller. He and his wife Jill signed book deals worth millions. They bought houses. They started foundations. The money came fast. Biden's wealth is entirely post-career, built on the value of his decades in public service and the fact that former vice presidents are in high demand for corporate speeches and memoir deals. He didn't inherit money. He didn't build businesses. He spent 50 years in government, then cashed in afterward, which is pretty much the standard path for modern politicians. And that's where we'll pause for now because we've covered the 15 wealthiest presidents. But there are 30 more to go, and trust me, it gets even more interesting when we start talking about presidents who died broke or who made their money in ways that would definitely get investigated today. But that's for the next section. For now, just know that presidential wealth is messy, complicated, and often deeply ironic. Sleep tight. George W. Bush. Bush is worth approximately $40 to $50 million today, which makes him comfortably wealthy, but nowhere near his father's wealth level. Bush was born into privilege in 1946, grew up in Texas, attended Yale and Harvard Business School, and had every advantage money and family connections could provide. But unlike his father, who made his own oil fortune, George W. had a more complicated path to wealth. Bush worked in the oil business in Texas during the 1970s and 80s with mixed results. His company, Arbusto Energy, which translates to Bush in Spanish but sounds unfortunately like a different word in English, struggled financially. It merged with another company, then another, never quite striking it rich during the Texas oil boom. By the mid 80s, Bush's oil career was basically over. Then came baseball. In 1989, Bush became managing general partner of the Texas Rangers, putting in a relatively small amount of his own money, but receiving a significant ownership stake. When the team was sold in 1998, Bush's initial $600,000 investment turned into nearly $15 million. That's where most of his personal wealth came from. Not oil, but baseball. Bush served as Texas governor from 1995 to 2000, then won the presidency in the controversial 2000 election decided by the Supreme Court. He served 2 terms, dealing with September 11th, 2 wars, and the 2008 financial crisis. After leaving office in 2009, Bush wrote memoirs, gave paid speeches, and painted portraits of world leaders, which is an unexpectedly wholesome retirement hobby for someone who invaded Iraq. Bush lives quietly in Dallas now, his wealth secure from baseball profits and post-presidential income. He's not generationally rich like Kennedy or Trump, but he's comfortable. And speaking of presidents who became comfortable through post office earnings, let's talk about Richard Nixon, who rebuilt his wealth after resigning in disgrace. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon died in 1994, worth approximately $25 to $35 million, which is remarkable considering he resigned the presidency in disgrace and could have easily ended up broke and unemployable. But Nixon was nothing if not resilient. And he spent his post-Watergate years slowly rebuilding his reputation and his bank account through books, speeches, and sheer determination to not be remembered only as the president who quit. Nixon grew up poor in California, the son of a grocer. He worked his way through Whittier College and Duke Law School, served in the Navy during World War II, and entered politics as a congressman in 1947. He became Eisenhower's vice president at 39, lost the presidential election to Kennedy in 1960, lost the California governor's race in 1962, then somehow won the presidency in 1968. It was a political comeback for the ages, right up until Watergate destroyed everything. Nixon resigned in August 1974, facing certain impeachment. He retreated to his homes in California and New Jersey, wrote his memoirs, and slowly rebuilt his finances. His book, R.N. The Memoirs of Richard Nixon, was a bestseller. He wrote additional books about foreign policy and became a respected elder statesman on international affairs, particularly regarding China and the Soviet Union. Nixon gave speeches, consulted with later presidents, and managed to rehabilitate his image just enough to be remembered as more than Watergate. When he died, his state funeral was attended by every living president. He'd gone from disgraced to dignified, and he'd made millions doing it. Nixon proved that even political disgrace doesn't have to mean financial ruin, at least not if you're willing to write books and outlive your scandals. And speaking of presidents who turned modest means into post-office wealth, let's talk about Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer who became a millionaire through carpentry and books. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is worth approximately $25 to $35 million as of 2025, and considering he grew peanuts for a living before becoming president, that's actually impressive. Carter was born in 1924 in Plains, Georgia, to a peanut farming family. He attended the Naval Academy, served on nuclear submarines, then returned home when his father died to run the family peanut business. He went from Navy officer to peanut warehouse manager, which is quite possibly the most humbling career transition in presidential history. Carter entered Georgia politics, became governor in 1971, then somehow won the presidency in 1976 as a Washington outsider, promising honesty after Watergate. He served one term, dealing with the Iran hostage crisis, an energy crisis, and an economy that made voters deeply unhappy. Ronald Reagan crushed him in 1980, and Carter returned to Georgia at age 56, his political career over. But then Carter did something unusual. He became the best former president in American history. He wrote dozens of books on everything from faith to the Middle East peace process. He built houses with Habitat for Humanity well into his 90s, physically hammering nails and hoisting beams. He founded the Carter Center, which monitors elections worldwide and works to eradicate diseases like guinea worm. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. All this earned money. Book advances, speaking fees, and his post-presidential work made Carter wealthy in a way that peanut farming never could. He lived modestly in the same house in Plains he bought in 1961, driving himself around town until recently. Carter turned his failed presidency into a successful legacy, and he made millions doing it with dignity. And speaking of dignity in office, let's talk about Gerald Ford, the accidental president who never actually won a national election. Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford died in 2006, worth approximately $20 to $30 million, all earned after his presidency ended in what has to be one of the most unexpected political exits in American history. Ford was a congressman from Michigan for 25 years, never particularly wealthy, just comfortably middle class. Then Spiro Agnew resigned as vice president in 1973, and Nixon appointed Ford to replace him. Then Nixon resigned in 1974, and suddenly Ford was president without ever running for vice president or president. It's the political equivalent of getting promoted because everyone above you quit. Ford served from August 1974 to January 1977, trying to heal the country after Watergate. His decision to pardon Nixon was deeply unpopular and probably cost him the 1976 election to Carter. Ford left office at age 63, relatively young for a former president, and immediately started making money. Ford joined corporate boards. He gave speeches for significant fees, reportedly earning up to $1 million per year from speaking engagements alone in the 1980s and 90s. He served on the boards of companies like American Express and consulted for various corporations. It was boring, respectable work that paid extremely well, and Ford did it for 3 decades. Ford was genial, unthreatening, and fundamentally decent, which made him perfect for corporate boards that wanted a former president's name attached to their company without any controversy. He lived in California, played golf, and enjoyed a long retirement with his wife Betty. When he died at 93, he'd outlived every president before him. Ford proved that losing an election doesn't mean losing financial security, especially if you're willing to sit through board meetings and give optimistic speeches to corporations. And speaking of optimistic military men, let's talk about Dwight Eisenhower, who commanded armies and then commanded corporate boardrooms. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight David Eisenhower was worth approximately $15 to $25 million when he died in 1969, and most of that came from writing his memoirs after World War II. Eisenhower grew up poor in Kansas, attended West Point, and spent decades as a career military officer, making very modest pay. He commanded Allied forces in Europe during World War II, planned D-Day, accepted Germany's surrender, and became the most famous general since Ulysses Grant. And just like Grant, Eisenhower turned that fame into book deals and eventually the presidency. After the war, Eisenhower wrote Crusade in Europe, his memoir of the war years. It became a massive bestseller, earning him over $600,000 in 1948 alone, which adjusted for inflation is roughly $8 million today. Congress even passed special legislation allowing Eisenhower to pay capital gains tax on the proceeds rather than income tax, saving him hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was basically a gift from Congress to a war hero, and Eisenhower accepted it gratefully. Eisenhower served as president of Columbia University briefly, though he spent most of that time running NATO. He won the presidency in 1952 and served 2 terms, presiding over post-war prosperity and the early Cold War. He built the interstate highway system, sent troops to integrate Little Rock schools, and warned about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. After leaving office in 1961, Eisenhower retired to his farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He wrote more books, consulted occasionally, and lived comfortably on his various income streams. He died of heart failure in 1969, financially secure and widely respected. Eisenhower showed that military service could lead to wealth, but only if you became famous enough to write best-selling memoirs about it. And speaking of presidents who struggled financially, let's talk about Harry Truman, who left office nearly broke. Harry S. Truman left the presidency in 1953 worth less than $1 million, and most of that was tied up in his house in Independence, Missouri. Truman might be the closest thing America had to a poor president in the 20th century, and his financial struggles after leaving office directly led to Congress creating the presidential pension system. So at least something good came from his near poverty. Truman grew up on a farm in Missouri, worked as a bank clerk, ran a haberdashery that failed, and entered politics through the Kansas City political machine. He became a senator in 1935, vice president in 1945, and president when Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945. Suddenly, Truman had to decide whether to drop atomic bombs on Japan, manage post-war reconstruction, and contain Soviet expansion. He had no preparation for any of it. Truman served until 1953, declining to run again after his approval ratings tanked during the Korean War. He returned to independence with basically no money. His only income was a small army pension of $112.78 per month. He couldn't afford staff or even postage to answer the thousands of letters he received. He took out a bank loan. He sold property. It was genuinely difficult. Truman refused corporate board positions because he thought it would be undignified for a former president. He eventually wrote his memoirs, which earned some money, but he struggled until Congress passed the Former President's Act in 1958, giving him a $25,000 annual pension. That saved him financially. Truman died in 1972, still living in the same modest house in Independence, still refusing to cash in on his presidency in ways he considered inappropriate. And speaking of presidents who maintained dignity despite financial hardship, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was worth approximately 5 to 8 million in today's dollars when he was assassinated in 1865, which made him solidly middle class, but nowhere near the wealthy planters who dominated politics before the Civil War. Lincoln grew up in poverty, taught himself law, and built a successful legal practice in Springfield, Illinois, representing railroads and other commercial interests. He owned one house, had some investments, and lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Lincoln's law practice was genuinely successful. He argued cases before the Supreme Court, represented major corporations, and earned a good living by the standards of 1850s Illinois. When he ran for president in 1860, he wasn't poor, but he also wasn't rich by any definition that mattered in a country where plantation owners counted their wealth in enslaved human beings and thousands of acres. Lincoln served from March 1861 until April 14, 1865, when John Wilkes Booth shot him at Ford's Theater. He guided the country through the Civil War, preserved the Union, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and delivered the Gettysburg Address. He won re-election in 1864 and was planning Reconstruction when he died. He never got to enjoy peace or retirement. Mary Todd Lincoln, his widow, struggled financially after his death. She had to petition Congress for a pension and eventually received $3,000 a year, which helped but wasn't substantial. She died in 1882, having spent years battling mental illness and financial insecurity. Lincoln proved that you didn't need plantation wealth to become president, just extraordinary political skill and timing. But financial success after the presidency, that wasn't really an option in the 1860s, especially if you got assassinated. And speaking of tragic post presidential finances, let's talk about Ulysses S. Grant, who died bankrupt despite being one of the most famous men in America. Ulysses S. Grant. Grant died in 1885, essentially bankrupt, which is a devastating end for the general who won the Civil War and served 2 terms as president. Grant was never good with money. He failed at farming, failed at business, and only succeeded at military command and heavy drinking, though he quit the latter during the war. After his presidency ended in 1877, Grant's financial incompetence caught up with him in spectacular fashion. Grant had no real income after leaving office. Presidential pensions didn't exist yet. He invested his life savings with a brokerage firm called Grant and Ward, where his son was a partner. The other partner, Ferdinand Ward, was running a Ponzi scheme. When it collapsed in 1884, Grant lost everything. He owed creditors hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was 62 years old, broke, and dying of throat cancer from decades of cigar smoking. But then Mark Twain showed up with an offer. Twain, who was also a publisher, convinced Grant to write his memoirs. Grant, in excruciating pain from cancer, spent his final year writing. He finished the manuscript days before dying in July 1885. The book was published and became a massive bestseller, earning Grant's widow nearly $450,000 in royalties, roughly $15 million in today's money. It saved his family from poverty. Grant's memoirs are considered some of the finest military writing in American history, clear and honest, and remarkably free of bitterness despite his personal disasters. He died broke, but his writing rescued his family, which is about as grand as anything could be, failing personally but succeeding when it mattered most. And speaking of presidents who managed money better than Grant, let's talk about William McKinley, who lived modestly and died with some wealth intact. William McKinley. William McKinley was worth approximately $3 to $6 million in today's currency when he was assassinated in 1901. McKinley grew up in Ohio, became a lawyer, served in Congress, and eventually became governor of Ohio before winning the presidency in 1896. He lived reasonably but not extravagantly, which put him squarely in the middle class of presidential wealth. McKinley's presidency was defined by the Spanish-American War in 1898, which lasted about 4 months and resulted in the U.S. acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It was America's emergence as a genuine imperial power, and McKinley oversaw all of it while maintaining his calm, grandfatherly demeanor. He won re-election in 1900, defeating William Jennings Bryan again, and seemed headed for a successful second term. Then on September 6, 1901, McKinley attended the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. While greeting visitors, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz shot him twice in the abdomen. McKinley lingered for 8 days, initially seeming to recover, then died on September 14th from gangrene caused by the bullets. He was 58 years old. McKinley's wife Ida received a $5,000 annual pension from Congress, one of the early examples of providing for presidential widows. His estate was modest but sufficient to care for her until she died in 1907. McKinley never sought wealth or spent much time thinking about money, which made him unusual among ambitious politicians, even in his own era. His assassination brought Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, which changed the trajectory of American politics entirely. But that's Roosevelt's story, which we already covered. Now let's talk about Grover Cleveland, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was worth approximately $8 to $12 million in today's money when he died in 1908, which he earned through his law practice and careful financial management across a very long career in public service. Cleveland was unusual in presidential history because he served two non consecutive terms, winning in 1884, losing to Benjamin Harrison in 1888, then defeating Harrison in 1892 to win again. He's the only president to do this, making him both the 22nd and 24th president, which creates endless confusion. Cleveland worked as a lawyer in Buffalo, New York, before entering politics. He became mayor of Buffalo, then governor of New York, then president, all within about 3 years. He was known for his honesty and opposition to corruption, which made him popular with reformers and unpopular with political machines that relied on patronage and graft. During his first term, Cleveland married Frances Folsom, who at 21 was the youngest First Lady in history. He was 49. They married in the White House in 1886, which was the only presidential wedding ceremony held there until Woodrow Wilson remarried decades later. The age gap raised eyebrows even in the 1880s, but the marriage lasted until Cleveland's death. After his second term ended in 1897, Cleveland retired to Princeton, New Jersey, where he lived comfortably on his legal earnings and investments. He gave occasional speeches, wrote articles, and served on corporate boards. He died in 1908 of a heart attack, financially secure and generally respected, though not particularly remembered by most Americans today. Cleveland proved that you could serve 8 years as president, separated by 4 years out of office, and still end up reasonably wealthy if you were smart with money. And speaking of presidents from that era, let's talk about Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of another president. Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was worth approximately $10 to $15 million in today's money, earned primarily through his law practice in Indianapolis and his political career. Harrison had the advantage of being the grandson of William Henry Harrison, who served as president for 31 days in 1841 before dying of pneumonia, though being related to a president who died immediately after taking office is probably less helpful than you'd think. Harrison was born in Ohio in 1833, attended Miami University, became a lawyer, and served as a Civil War officer before settling in Indianapolis. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1881 and then won the presidency in 1888, despite losing the popular vote to Grover Cleveland. The Electoral College made Harrison president, which Cleveland deeply resented and which voters corrected in 1892 by electing Cleveland again. Harrison's single term was relatively unremarkable. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, expanded the Navy, and dealt with labor strikes. He lost his wife Caroline to tuberculosis in October 1892, just weeks before losing the election. After leaving office in 1893, Harrison returned to Indianapolis, remarried in 1896 to his deceased wife's niece, which was legal but socially awkward, and resumed his law practice. Harrison argued cases before the Supreme Court and earned substantial fees representing railroads and corporations. He wrote articles and gave lectures, supplementing his legal income. He died of pneumonia in 1901 at age 67. Financially comfortable and largely forgotten by history, except as the president sandwiched between Cleveland's two terms, Harrison showed that name recognition and legal expertise could build moderate wealth, even if your actual presidency was forgettable. And speaking of presidents whose legacy outlasted their wealth, let's talk about William Howard Taft, the only president to later serve as Chief Justice. William Howard Taft was worth approximately $10 to $20 million when he died in 1930, and unlike most presidents, Taft's wealth continued growing after his presidency because he did something unprecedented. He became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the job he actually wanted all along. Taft never really wanted to be president. His wife and Theodore Roosevelt pushed him into it, and he spent 4 years being miserable before voters ended his suffering in 1912. Taft grew up in Cincinnati in a wealthy family. His father was a judge and diplomat. Taft attended Yale and Cincinnati Law School, served as a federal judge, governor of the Philippines, and Secretary of War under Roosevelt. When Roosevelt declined to run in 1908, he handpicked Taft as his successor, assuming Taft would continue Roosevelt's progressive policies. Taft did not. The two men had a bitter falling out. Roosevelt ran as a third-party candidate in 1912, and Woodrow Wilson won the presidency while Taft came in third. Taft left office in 1913, taught law at Yale, and served on various boards. Then in 1921, President Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Taft was ecstatic. He served for 9 years, shaping constitutional law and finally doing the job he'd always wanted. He also continued earning money through his Yale salary and various legal activities. Taft died in 1930, still serving as Chief Justice until illness forced him to retire weeks before his death. He weighed over 300 pounds for most of his adult life, famously got stuck in the White House bathtub, and had a special oversized tub installed. But he died happy, having finally escaped the presidency for the judiciary. And speaking of presidents who struggled after leaving office, let's talk about Woodrow Wilson, who left the White House broke and broken. Woodrow Wilson left the presidency in 1921, worth less than $1 million and in terrible health after suffering a massive stroke in October 1919 that left him partially paralyzed and mentally impaired. His wife Edith essentially ran the executive branch for the final 17 months of his presidency, which remains one of the most bizarre constitutional crises in American history that nobody really talks about. Wilson was born in Virginia in 1856, earned a PhD in political science, and became president of Princeton University before entering politics as governor of New Jersey. He won the presidency in 1912 thanks to Roosevelt and Taft splitting the Republican vote. Wilson led America through World War I, championed the League of Nations, and won the Nobel Peace Prize. Then his health collapsed, his League of Nations failed to get Senate approval, and he left office a broken man. Wilson had no real income after his presidency. He bought a house on S Street in Washington, D.C., where he lived in semi-seclusion. He tried to practice law briefly but was too ill. His financial situation was precarious enough that friends quietly helped support him. He received no presidential pension because those didn't exist yet. He lived off savings and whatever income his writings generated, which wasn't much. Wilson died in 1924 at age 67, having spent his final years bitter about the League of Nations failure and frustrated by his physical limitations. His estate was modest. Edith lived until 1961, having successfully protected Wilson's reputation and her own role in his presidency. Wilson proved that even world-changing presidents could end up nearly broke if they got sick at the wrong time. And speaking of unexpected financial outcomes, let's talk about Calvin Coolidge, who became surprisingly wealthy through books and corporate boards. Calvin Coolidge died in 1933 worth approximately 5 to 10 million in today's dollars, which he earned through autobiography sales, newspaper columns, and corporate board positions after leaving office. Coolidge was the most unlikely president imaginable, a taciturn Vermont lawyer who became governor of Massachusetts, vice president, and then president when Warren Harding died suddenly in 1923. Coolidge was so quiet that his nickname was Silent Cal, and there are countless stories of him saying almost nothing at dinner parties while everyone waited awkwardly for him to speak. Coolidge won election in his own right in 1924 and served until 1929, presiding over the Roaring Twenties with a philosophy of minimal government interference in business. The stock market boomed, speculation ran wild. Coolidge believed in letting the market regulate itself, which worked great right up until it catastrophically didn't in October 1929, 8 months after he left office. Coolidge avoided blame for the Great Depression mostly by excellent timing. After leaving the White House, Coolidge returned to Massachusetts and immediately started making money. He wrote his autobiography, which sold well. He wrote a daily syndicated newspaper column, which paid handsomely. He joined the board of New York Life Insurance, which added steady income. He lived quietly in Northampton with his wife Grace, gardening and managing his unexpected wealth. Coolidge died suddenly of a heart attack in January 1933 at age 60. The Great Depression was crushing the country, but Coolidge died financially comfortable, having monetized his presidency in respectable ways. He proved that even famously silent presidents could make noise in the corporate world if they wanted to. And finally, let's talk about Warren G. Harding, who might be the most scandalous president on this entire list. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding died in office in August 1923, worth approximately $5 to $8 million in today's money. But most of that was tied up in his newspaper business in Marion, Ohio, and his estate had debts from various scandals that erupted after his death. Harding is consistently ranked among the worst presidents in American history, not because of his policies, but because his administration was staggeringly corrupt. Harding was a newspaper publisher who looked like Central Casting's idea of a president: handsome, white-haired, and dignified. He won the Republican nomination in 1920 through backroom dealing and won the general election in a landslide. Then he appointed his friends to key positions, and those friends immediately started looting the government. The Teapot Dome scandal involved oil reserves being secretly leased in exchange for bribes. His attorney general went to prison. His Veterans Bureau director went to prison. His administration was a disaster. Harding himself wasn't directly implicated in most scandals, possibly because he died before investigators got to him. He suffered a heart attack while traveling in San Francisco in August 1923, though rumors persisted for years that his wife poisoned him, which probably isn't true, but says something about how chaotic his presidency was that people found it plausible. Harding left behind a modest fortune and a catastrophic legacy. His wife Florence burned many of his papers after his death, presumably to protect whatever secrets remained. The debts from legal fees and scandal fallout diminished the estate, but Florence received a pension from Congress and lived until 1924. Harding proved that looking presidential and being presidential are different things, and that corruption is expensive even if you personally don't go to prison. And with that cheerful note, we've covered 30 presidents, 15 more to go. Chester A. Arthur was worth approximately $6 to $10 million in today's money when he died in 1886, and he earned most of it through a lucrative career as a New York lawyer and political operative before accidentally becoming president. Arthur was never supposed to be president. He was a machine politician, a creature of the New York patronage system, someone who got rich from customs house positions and political favors. Then James Garfield got shot, and suddenly Arthur was in charge of the entire country. Arthur worked as a lawyer in New York City, representing clients in commercial disputes and earning substantial fees. He became collector of the New York Custom House in 1871, a position that was essentially a license to print money through the spoils system. Customs collectors appointed their own staff, took a percentage of seized goods, and wielded enormous political influence. Arthur made a fortune and helped run the Republican political machine under Senator Roscoe Conkling. When Garfield won the presidency in 1880, he needed to balance the ticket with a machine politician to appease Conkling's faction. Arthur became vice president, a mostly ceremonial role that everyone assumed would keep him harmlessly occupied. Then on July 2nd, 1881, Charles Guiteau shot Garfield at a train station. Garfield lingered for 80 days before dying in September. Arthur became president at age 51, and everyone assumed he'd be a corrupt disaster. Except Arthur surprised everyone. He supported civil service reform, breaking with his patronage past. He vetoed wasteful spending bills. He modernized the Navy. He proved to be a competent even principled president, which baffled his old political allies who expected him to reward them with government jobs and contracts. Arthur had money already. He didn't need to steal more. Arthur suffered from Bright's disease, a kidney ailment, throughout his presidency. He didn't run for re-election in 1884, retired to New York, and died in November 1886 at age 57. His estate was comfortable, built on years of legal work and customs house earnings that would definitely be illegal today. He proved that machine politicians could occasionally transcend their origins, though usually only after a national tragedy forced their hand. And speaking of presidents who came to office under unusual circumstances, let's talk about Rutherford B. Hayes, who won the most contested election in American history. Hayes was worth approximately $8 to $12 million in today's money when he died in 1893, having earned his wealth through legal practice, real estate investments, and careful financial management over a long career. But Hayes is mostly remembered for the election of 1876, which was so disputed and controversial that it nearly sparked another civil war just 11 years after the first one ended. Hayes grew up in Ohio, attended Harvard Law School, and established a successful practice in Cincinnati. He served as a Union officer during the Civil War, was wounded 5 times, and ended the war as a brevet major general. He entered politics as a congressman, then served 3 terms as Ohio governor. In 1876, Republicans nominated him for president against Democrat Samuel Tilden. The election was a disaster. Tilden won the popular vote by about 250,000 votes. The electoral vote came down to disputed returns in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where both parties claimed victory amid accusations of fraud and voter intimidation. Congress created an electoral commission to decide the outcome, which voted along party lines 8-7 to give all disputed votes to Hayes. He won the Electoral College by a single vote, 185 to 184. Democrats were furious. The compromise to avoid violence involved Hayes agreeing to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and abandoning black voters to Jim Crow laws that would oppress them for another century. Hayes took office in March 1877, knowing half the country considered him illegitimate. He served 1 term, declined to run for re-election, and retired to Ohio. Hayes spent his retirement on philanthropy, supporting education and prison reform. He lived on his investments and legal earnings, comfortable but not ostentatious. He died of a heart attack in January 1893 at age 70. His presidency is remembered for its controversial beginning and his decision to abandon Reconstruction, a choice that haunted the South for generations. Hayes proved that you could win an election while losing the popular vote and still govern, though the moral cost of that victory remains debatable. And speaking of presidents who didn't get much time to govern, let's talk about James Garfield, who served only 6 months before being assassinated. James A. Garfield was worth approximately $3 to $5 million in today's money when Charles Guiteau shot him on July 2nd, 1881, just 4 months into his presidency. Garfield was the last president born in a log cabin, which he mentioned frequently because it was excellent campaign material in the 1870s when voters still found that sort of thing compelling. He worked his way from poverty to a career as a congressman, minister, educator, and lawyer before winning the presidency in a tight election against Winfield Scott Hancock. Garfield grew up poor in Ohio, worked as a canal boat driver as a teenager, attended Williams College in Massachusetts, and became a professor and eventually president of what is now Hiram College in Ohio. He studied law, passed the bar, and was elected to the Ohio State Senate in 1859. During the Civil War, he served as a major general, leading troops at Shiloh and Chickamauga before resigning to serve in Congress. Garfield spent 17 years in the House of Representatives, becoming a skilled legislator and orator. He earned a decent salary and practiced law on the side, accumulating moderate wealth through investments and legal fees. When Republicans deadlocked at their 1880 convention, Garfield emerged as a compromise candidate on the 36th ballot. He won the general election by fewer than 10,000 votes out of 9 million cast. Garfield's presidency lasted exactly 6 months and 15 days. On July 2nd, 1881, he was walking through a Washington train station when Charles Guiteau, a mentally ill office seeker who believed God wanted him to kill the president, shot Garfield twice. One bullet grazed his arm, the other lodged near his spine. Doctors probed the wound with unwashed hands and instruments, introducing infection. Garfield lingered through the summer in agony, while doctors tried everything from electric probes to feeding him rectally. He died on September 19th, 1881, at age 49. Garfield's assassination led directly to civil service reform, as Guiteau had claimed he shot Garfield over a denied political appointment. Congress passed the Pendleton Act in 1883, beginning the end of the spoils system. Garfield's widow, Lucretia, received a $50,000 grant from Congress and later a $5,000 annual pension. And speaking of troubled presidencies, let's talk about Andrew Johnson, who became president after Lincoln's assassination and promptly became the first president ever impeached. Andrew Johnson was worth approximately 2 to 5 million in today's dollars when he died in 1875, though his wealth fluctuated wildly throughout his life due to the Civil War, impeachment, and his general inability to get along with anyone. Johnson was the only president who never attended a day of school. He was illiterate until his teenage years when his wife taught him to read and write. He worked as a tailor, entered politics in Tennessee, and rose through sheer determination and stubbornness, of which he had inexhaustible supplies. Johnson served as governor of Tennessee and then as a U.S. senator. When Tennessee seceded in 1861, Johnson was the only Southern senator who refused to join the Confederacy. He stayed loyal to the Union, which made him a hero in the North and a traitor in the South. Lincoln chose him as vice president in 1864 to show unity between North and loyal Southern states. Then Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, and Johnson became president at the worst possible moment. Johnson opposed the Republican Congress's Reconstruction plans, believing Southern states should be quickly readmitted without protecting freed slaves' rights. He vetoed civil rights legislation. He fought with Congress constantly. In February 1868, the House impeached him for violating the Tenure of Office Act by firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The Senate trial lasted 3 months. Johnson survived removal by a single vote. 35 senators voted guilty, one short of the 2/3 needed to convict. Johnson finished his term in March 1869, returned to Tennessee, and spent years trying to rehabilitate his reputation. He was elected to the Senate again in 1875, the only former president to return to that body. He served 5 months before dying of a stroke in July 1875 at age 66. His estate was modest, his legacy controversial, and his presidency generally considered a failure for abandoning freed slaves to terror and oppression. Johnson proved that loyalty during crisis doesn't guarantee competence afterward, and that surviving impeachment doesn't mean you were right. And speaking of failed presidencies, let's talk about James Buchanan, whose inaction helped cause the Civil War. James Buchanan. James Buchanan was worth approximately $5 to $10 million in today's money when he left office in March 1861, and he spent the next 7 years watching the country tear itself apart in a war he arguably could have prevented. Buchanan was the only president who never married, which sparked rumors throughout his political career that he politely ignored. He lived with Alabama Senator William Rufus King for 15 years in Washington, and people talked, but Buchanan never addressed it publicly, and neither did anyone else in official capacity, because that's just how the 1840s worked. Buchanan made his money as a lawyer in Pennsylvania, representing commercial clients and building a successful practice. He served in Congress as minister to Russia, as a senator, as Secretary of State under James Polk, and as minister to Great Britain under Franklin Pierce. When Democrats nominated him for president in 1856, he'd been in politics for 40 years and was considered a safe, experienced choice. He was neither. Buchanan's presidency was a catastrophe of indecision. The country was fracturing over slavery, and Buchanan sided with the South while claiming he wanted to preserve the Union. He supported the Dred Scott decision. He opposed abolitionists. When Southern states began seceding after Lincoln won the 1860 election, Buchanan declared secession illegal but said the federal government had no power to stop it. He did nothing while the country slid toward war, then handed the crisis to Lincoln in March 1861. Buchanan retired to his estate Wheatland in Pennsylvania, where he lived until 1868, writing a memoir defending his presidency that convinced no one. The Civil War killed 600,000 people. Buchanan spent his final years insisting he wasn't responsible, which is technically true in the sense that he didn't fire the first shot, but morally questionable given that he spent 4 years refusing to act while the crisis built. Buchanan died at age 77, wealthy and widely blamed for the war. Historians consistently rank him among the worst presidents in American history, and his estate couldn't buy him a better legacy. And speaking of presidents whose legacies were destroyed by their own poor choices, let's talk about Franklin Pierce, whose alcoholism and political failures made his presidency a tragedy. Franklin Pierce left the presidency in 1857 worth less than $1 million in today's dollars, and he spent the next 12 years drinking himself to death while the country he'd failed to lead collapsed into civil war. Pierce was a handsome, charming New Hampshire lawyer who seemed destined for greatness until personal tragedy and political incompetence destroyed him. He entered the White House grieving, left it disgraced, and died in obscurity. Pierce's tragedies began before his presidency. His first 2 children died young. Then in January 1853, 2 months before his inauguration, Pierce and his family were traveling by train when their car derailed and rolled down an embankment. Pierce and his wife Jane survived. Their 11-year-old son Benny was killed instantly, crushed before their eyes. Jane Pierce never recovered emotionally. She spent her time in the White House writing letters to her dead son and avoiding public events. Pierce turned to alcohol. Pierce's presidency was a disaster. He supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which let territories decide whether to allow slavery through popular sovereignty. This led directly to Bleeding Kansas, a violent conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers that killed hundreds and previewed the Civil War. Pierce sent federal troops to enforce pro-slavery territorial governments, alienating Northern Democrats and emboldening the South. By 1856, his own party refused to renominate him. After leaving office, Pierce returned to New Hampshire and drank. His law practice collapsed. His wife died in 1863. During the Civil War, Pierce criticized Lincoln and supported the Confederacy's right to secede, making him deeply unpopular in the North. He became a recluse, his health destroyed by cirrhosis and alcoholism. He died in October 1869 at age 64, broke and forgotten. Pierce proved that charm and good looks aren't enough for the presidency, and that personal tragedy can derail even promising political careers. And speaking of presidents from that turbulent pre-Civil War era, let's talk about Millard Fillmore, whose name sounds made up, but who was, in fact, a real president. Millard Fillmore was worth approximately 8 to 12 million in today's dollars when he died in 1874, having built his wealth through legal practice and real estate investments in Buffalo, New York. Fillmore is mostly remembered today for having an absurd name and for being president when nobody can quite remember, but he actually had a significant impact on the country's trajectory toward civil war, mostly by trying desperately to prevent it through compromise that satisfied no one. Fillmore grew up poor in upstate New York, taught himself law, and established a practice in Buffalo. He served in Congress as a Whig, supporting infrastructure improvements and protective tariffs. In 1848, Zachary Taylor chose Fillmore as his running mate to balance the ticket geographically. Taylor won, served 16 months, then died suddenly in July 1850 after eating cherries and drinking cold milk at a 4th of July celebration. Fillmore became president at age 50. Fillmore's presidency was dominated by the Compromise of 1850, a series of bills meant to settle the slavery question. California entered as a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Act required Northerners to return escaped slaves to their owners, turning ordinary citizens into slave catchers. The law was morally repugnant and practically unenforceable in many northern cities. Fillmore enforced it anyway, destroying his political career in the process. The Whig Party collapsed under the slavery debate. Fillmore didn't even win his party's nomination in 1852. He ran for president again in 1856 as the candidate of the Know Nothing Party, a nativist anti-immigrant movement, and lost badly. He retired to Buffalo, where he lived comfortably on his legal earnings and real estate investments. He helped found the Buffalo Historical Society and the Buffalo General Hospital. He died in March 1874 at age 74 after suffering a stroke. Fillmore proved that compromise on fundamental moral questions often just delays inevitable conflict while angering everyone involved. And speaking of presidents who made questionable choices, let's talk about John Tyler, who joined the Confederacy and died in disgrace. John Tyler died in January 1862 in Richmond, Virginia. A member of the Confederate House of Representatives, having lost his fortune and his place in American history by choosing the wrong side in the Civil War. Tyler was worth substantial money at various points in his life, perhaps 20 to 30 million in today's dollars at his peak, earned through his Virginia plantation and enslaved labor. But by the time he died, he'd lost everything to his decision to join the rebellion against the country he once led. Tyler became president in April 1841 when William Henry Harrison died after 31 days in office. Tyler was the first vice president to assume the presidency due to death, and nobody was quite sure if he was actually president or just acting president. Tyler declared himself president with full powers, setting the precedent that vice presidents who assume office become president completely, not temporarily. Congress hated him for this. Tyler's presidency was contentious. He vetoed Whig Party legislation, and his entire cabinet resigned except Secretary of State Daniel Webster, who stayed only to finish treaty negotiations. Tyler was expelled from the Whig Party while still president. He accomplished little except annexing Texas, which brought the issue of slavery's expansion to a crisis point. He didn't run for re-election in 1844 and returned to his Virginia plantation. When the Civil War began, Tyler initially tried to mediate between North and South. When that failed, he chose Virginia. He was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives in November 1861. He died 2 months later of a stroke at age 71. The Union government didn't acknowledge his death. No flags flew at half-staff in Washington. Tyler was the only president to be considered an enemy of the United States at his death. His Virginia estates were confiscated. His family struggled financially during and after the war. Tyler's legacy as the president who joined the Confederacy overshadowed everything else he accomplished. And speaking of presidents who owned plantations, let's talk about Zachary Taylor, the Mexican war hero who died eating fruit. Zachary Taylor was worth approximately 15 to 20 million in today's dollars at his peak, earned primarily through his Louisiana plantation and enslaved labor. But Taylor only served 16 months as president before dying in July 1850, under circumstances that are either extremely mundane or possibly murder, depending on which conspiracy theory you prefer. The official story is that he ate cherries and drank cold milk at a 4th of July celebration, got severe gastroenteritis, and died 5 days later. The conspiracy theory is that he was poisoned by Southern politicians angry about his opposition to slavery expansion. Either way, he's dead. Taylor was a career military officer who never voted until he was 62 years old because he moved around too much with the army to establish residency anywhere. He became a national hero during the Mexican-American War, particularly after his victory at Buena Vista in February 1847 against a Mexican force 3 times his size. The Whig Party nominated him for president in 1848, despite Taylor having no political experience and barely any political opinions. He won anyway because America loves war heroes. Taylor owned a plantation in Louisiana with around 150 enslaved people, which made him wealthy. But oddly for a Southern slaveholder, Taylor opposed letting slavery expand into territories acquired from Mexico. He believed new states should decide the slavery question themselves when they applied for statehood, which infuriated Southern politicians who wanted slavery guaranteed in new territories. Taylor threatened to lead the army personally against any state that tried to secede, which would have been quite a scene given that he was in his 60s and increasingly ill. Then Taylor attended the 4th of July celebration at the unfinished Washington Monument in 1850. The day was brutally hot. Taylor ate cherries and drank cold milk or iced water. Accounts vary. He developed severe stomach cramps, probably gastroenteritis or cholera. Doctors tried every treatment available in 1850, which mostly meant making things worse. He died on July 9th at age 65. In 1991, Taylor's body was exhumed to test for arsenic poisoning. Tests came back negative. He probably died from contaminated food or water, not assassination, though the conspiracy theory persists because it's more interesting than death by cherries. And speaking of presidents who didn't live long enough to enjoy their wealth, let's talk about James K. Polk, who worked himself to death. James Knox Polk was worth approximately 10 to 15 million in today's dollars when he left office in March 1849, and he died 3 months later in June, having literally worked himself to death at age 53. Polk was the most effective one-term president in American history, accomplishing every major goal he set for himself and then dying almost immediately afterward, which is both impressive and deeply sad. Polk was a Tennessee lawyer and congressman who served as Speaker of the House under Andrew Jackson. He earned money through legal practice and owned a plantation in Mississippi with enslaved labor, which provided substantial income. He was elected president in 1844 on a platform of westward expansion, and he actually delivered. He negotiated the Oregon Treaty with Britain, acquiring the Pacific Northwest. He provoked and won the Mexican-American War, seizing California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. He added more territory to the United States than any president except Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase. Polk also lowered tariffs, established an independent treasury system, and micromanaged every aspect of his administration because he trusted no one. He worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, for 4 years straight. His health deteriorated from stress and exhaustion. He frequently suffered from chronic diarrhea, which 18th century medicine could do nothing about, except maybe make worse. He looked decades older at the end of his term than at the beginning. Polk declined to run for re-election, having accomplished everything he intended. He left Washington in March 1849 and began a tour of the South. By June, he was seriously ill with cholera. He died at his home in Nashville on June 15, 1849, just 103 days after leaving office. He was the youngest former president to die and the shortest-lived of all former presidents. Polk proved that you could achieve everything you wanted politically and still pay a devastating price in health and longevity. And speaking of presidents whose ambitions cost them, let's talk about Martin Van Buren, who died nearly bankrupt after years of failed political comebacks. Martin Van Buren died in July 1862, worth almost nothing. Having spent his final years watching his wealth disappear along with his political relevance, Van Buren was born in Kinderhook, New York, in 1782, making him the first president born after American independence and the first whose first language wasn't English. He grew up speaking Dutch in his immigrant community. He trained as a lawyer, became extraordinarily successful in New York politics, and eventually served as Secretary of State and Vice President under Andrew Jackson before winning the presidency himself in 1836. Van Buren's presidency was destroyed by the Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that began 2 months into his term and lasted years. Banks failed, unemployment soared. Van Buren's response was to oppose federal intervention, believing the economy would self-correct. It didn't, at least not quickly enough to save his presidency. He lost re-election in 1840 to William Henry Harrison in a landslide. Van Buren spent the next 22 years trying to return to political power. He ran for president again in 1848 as the Free Soil Party candidate, opposing slavery's expansion but still losing badly. He watched the Whig and Democratic parties fracture over slavery while his own political movement went nowhere. His wealth, earned from legal practice and real estate, gradually eroded through poor investments and the cost of maintaining his estate, Lindenwald, in Kinderhook. By the 1860s, Van Buren was nearly broke. The Civil War began, and Van Buren supported the Union despite his previous compromises on slavery. He died in July 1862 at age 79, his estate diminished, his political legacy mixed. He'd been a brilliant political operator who rose to the presidency, but couldn't handle the economic crisis that defined his term. His financial decline mirrored his political fall, both slow and seemingly inevitable once they began. Van Buren proved that political skill doesn't guarantee economic competence, and that presidential success often depends on timing and luck. And speaking of complicated legacies, let's talk about John Quincy Adams, the only son of a president to also become president. John Quincy Adams died in February 1848, worth technically more in debts than assets, despite having been worth perhaps 10 to 20 million in today's dollars at various points in his life. Adams was the son of John Adams, second president of the United States, which gave him both tremendous advantages and impossible expectations. He spent his entire life in public service, serving as ambassador, senator, secretary of state, president, and then congressman. And he died literally at work, collapsing on the House floor at age 80 after suffering a stroke. Adams grew up with every privilege wealth and family connections could provide. He spoke multiple languages, studied at European universities, and served as a diplomat before age 30. He was brilliant, accomplished, and deeply difficult to like. His presidency from 1825 to 1829 was contentious. He won the election in the House of Representatives after no candidate secured an electoral majority, and Andrew Jackson's supporters claimed Adams and Henry Clay made a corrupt bargain to steal the election. Adams accomplished little legislatively and lost re-election to Jackson in 1828. Then Adams did something unprecedented. Instead of retiring, he ran for Congress and won. He served 17 years in the House of Representatives, becoming a fierce opponent of slavery and defending the right to petition against the gag rule that prevented discussion of slavery in Congress. He argued the Amistad case before the Supreme Court in 1841, defending enslaved Africans who'd seized their transport ship. He became old man eloquent, fighting slavery until the very end. But Adams's finances were a mess. He'd inherited money from his parents, earned salaries from various positions, and owned property in Massachusetts, but he spent lavishly, invested poorly, and supported extended family members financially. By his final years, debts exceeded his assets. He died on February 23, 1848, 2 days after collapsing in the House chamber. He was 80 years old, still working, still fighting, and still broke. Adams proved that public service and wealth are often incompatible, especially for those who refuse to monetize their positions. And speaking of founding fathers who died in financial difficulty, let's talk about James Monroe, who died depending on friends' charity. James Monroe. James Monroe died in July 1831, essentially broke, living in his daughter's house in New York City and depending on financial assistance from friends to pay basic expenses. This was a devastating end for the man who had been the fifth president, the last of the founding generation to hold the office, and the architect of the Monroe Doctrine that shaped American foreign policy for a century. Monroe had been wealthy earlier in life, but a combination of poor financial management and the cost of public service destroyed his estate. Monroe was born in Virginia in 1758, served in the Continental Army under Washington, studied law under Thomas Jefferson, and began a political career that lasted 5 decades. He served as ambassador to France, governor of Virginia, secretary of state, and secretary of war before winning the presidency in 1816. His administration was called the Era of Good Feelings because partisan conflict was minimal, at least on the surface. He won re-election in 1820, receiving all but one electoral vote. But Monroe spent decades in government service at his own financial expense. Diplomatic missions to Europe cost him more than his government salary covered. He purchased furniture and supplies for the White House after the British burned it in 1814, expecting reimbursement that came slowly or not at all. He sold property to cover expenses. When he left office in 1825, he was already in financial difficulty. Monroe spent his final years petitioning Congress for reimbursement of expenses from his diplomatic service. Congress eventually granted him $30,000, but it wasn't enough to cover his debts. His wife, Elizabeth, died in 1830. Monroe moved to New York to live with his daughter Maria and her husband. He died on July 4th, 1831, exactly 5 years after John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died, on the same day in 1826. He was 73 years old, penniless, and dependent on others' generosity. Monroe proved that serving your country doesn't guarantee financial security, and that even presidents can die broke if they're unlucky or poor with money. And speaking of presidents who died quickly, let's talk about William Henry Harrison, who served 31 days before pneumonia killed him. William Henry Harrison was worth approximately $15 million in today's dollars at his peak, earned primarily through military service, his Ohio farm, and political positions. But Harrison is remembered almost exclusively for delivering the longest inaugural address in history on a cold, wet day in March 1841, without wearing a coat or hat, then dying of pneumonia 31 days later. Except that's probably not what killed him. Modern analysis suggests he died of enteric fever caused by contaminated water, which is less poetic but more accurate. Harrison was born in Virginia in 1773 to a wealthy family. His father signed the Declaration of Independence. He studied medicine briefly, joined the army, fought in the Indian Wars, and became a war hero after the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, which gave him his campaign nickname Tippecanoe for his 1840 presidential run. His campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, referring to his running mate John Tyler, and it's one of the catchiest political slogans in American history, despite meaning nothing. Harrison won the presidency at age 68, the oldest president elected until Ronald Reagan. He delivered his inaugural address on March 4th, 1841, speaking for nearly 2 hours in cold rain without proper clothing, apparently to demonstrate his physical vigor. 3 weeks later, he felt ill. Doctors diagnosed pneumonia and began treatments that included bloodletting, opium, and laxatives, which likely made things worse. Harrison died on April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after taking office. His widow Anna received no pension. Presidential pensions didn't exist yet. She received $25,000 from Congress as a special grant and struggled financially until Congress granted her a $1,200 annual pension in 1855. She died in 1864, having outlived her famous husband by 23 years. Harrison proved that long inaugural addresses can't kill you, but contaminated water definitely can. And speaking of founding fathers, let's talk about John Adams, who had a much longer and more successful post-presidential life. John Adams. John Adams died on July 4th, 1826, worth approximately 5 to 10 million in today's dollars, having lived to age 90 and witnessed the country he helped create grow from 13 colonies to 24 states. Adams was never as wealthy as Washington or Jefferson. He didn't own enslaved people or vast plantations, but he earned a comfortable living as a lawyer in Massachusetts and managed his money carefully enough to support his family and die solvent, which honestly makes him more fiscally responsible than several presidents we've discussed. Adams was born in Massachusetts in 1735, graduated from Harvard, and became a lawyer in Boston. He defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre in 1770, arguing that everyone deserves legal representation even when it's unpopular, which is admirably principled but definitely didn't help his finances. He served in the Continental Congress, helped draft the Declaration of Independence, served as ambassador to France and Britain, and became the first vice president under Washington. He won the presidency in 1796 and served one term, losing re-election to Jefferson in 1800. Adams retired to his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts, where he lived for 25 years, writing letters, reading, and slowly reconciling with Jefferson after years of bitter political rivalry. Their correspondence in old age is some of the finest political writing in American history. Two founding fathers reflecting on revolution, democracy, and mortality. Adams died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, just hours after Jefferson died at Monticello. His last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing Jefferson had died earlier that morning. It's one of history's most poignant coincidences. Two founding fathers dying on the same day they'd both risked their lives to sign the Declaration decades earlier. Adams's estate was comfortable, not extravagant. His son, John Quincy, would become president, and his descendants would include historians, diplomats, and writers, making the Adams family one of America's most distinguished political dynasties. And finally, let's return to where we began this section, with James Madison, who died in debt despite once being one of the wealthiest founding fathers. James Madison died in June 1836 at age 85, drowning in debt despite once being worth over 130 million in today's dollars. We talked about Madison's peak wealth earlier, the plantation at Montpelier, the enslaved labor that made it profitable, the land speculation that multiplied his holdings, but we didn't talk about how it all fell apart, because sometimes the story of presidential wealth isn't just about accumulation. It's about loss, bad decisions, and the uncomfortable reality that many founding fathers died broke because their fortunes depended on systems that were already collapsing. Madison's financial decline began with tobacco. Virginia's soil was exhausted from decades of tobacco farming. Prices fell, yields dropped. Madison tried switching to wheat, but it required different labor patterns and less intensive cultivation, which meant his investment in enslaved people became less profitable. He couldn't sell them without moral contradiction. He privately opposed slavery even while depending on it, so he held on while his plantation lost money year after year. Then there was his stepson, John Payne Todd, Dolly's son from her first marriage. Todd was a gambler and wastrel who ran up enormous debts that Madison repeatedly covered, draining the estate of cash. Madison loaned him money that never came back. He paid off creditors. He mortgaged property. Todd was a financial black hole, and Madison kept throwing money into it out of love for Dolly. When Madison died in 1836, his estate was insolvent. Dolly had to sell Montpelier and many of the enslaved people to pay creditors. She moved to Washington, struggled financially for years, and eventually sold Madison's papers to Congress for desperately needed money. She died in 1849, having spent 13 years fighting to preserve some dignity from the wreckage of Madison's financial collapse. Madison's story is the perfect ending to this tour of presidential wealth because it captures everything: early success built on exploitation, the precariousness of agricultural wealth, the cost of family obligations, and the uncomfortable truth that even brilliant founders couldn't always manage money. Wealth comes, wealth goes, and sometimes it takes longer to lose it than it did to build it, which is its own kind of tragedy. And that finally is the complete story of how rich every president was, from Trump's billions to Madison's debts, from real estate empires to peanut farms to law practices that barely paid the rent. Some inherited fortunes, some built them, many lost them, but all of them ended up in the history books, which is worth more than money anyway, at least according to people who had the money first. Sleep well, and maybe invest in something safer than plantations and stepchildren. And that brings us to the present: 46 presidents, spanning from inherited plantation wealth to post-presidency book deals, from oil fortunes to nearly going broke while in office. Some made their money before politics. Some made it after. And some, like Grant and Monroe and Wilson, proved that being president doesn't guarantee financial security, just a place in the history books and maybe, if you're lucky, a pension that keeps you from relying on friends' charity. So the next time you wonder how rich you'd need to be to run for president, just remember, one guy sold peanuts, another hosted a reality show, and Ulysses S. Grant died bankrupt, but saved his family by writing a memoir while dying of throat cancer. The presidency is many things, but a guaranteed path to wealth? That depends entirely on when you cash in. Sleep well, and maybe be grateful you don't have to explain your finances to historians 200 years from now. Good night.